When Anne Byrn is in the kitchen, even the simplest recipe can turn into a history lesson. That's because she understands so well that food isn't just about satisfying our hunger or being delicious. Sure, it's about those things, but food is also part of who we are. It's part of where we come from. Food always has a story to tell. And that's especially true here in the South, where complicated histories have combined and overlapped in some fascinating ways. In her new book, Baking in the American South, Anne does more than provide well-researched recipes. She brings them alive with her storytelling. And you might be surprised to hear how she got into cookbooks in the first place. I'll give you a little hint. It involves a certain Nashville newspaper. Before we dig in, here's Anne in the kitchen with her daughter, preparing one of the recipes that didn't make it into the book.
And it's called Nanny Rain's Nutty Delight. It may remind you of a recipe that's been in your family because it starts with egg whites that you beat with sugar and add a little bit of baking powder and vanilla. And you beat them until they're stiff. It is essentially a meringue. But what I'm going to fold in are about 1.25 cups of crushed club crackers and about 1 cup of pecans. And in Texas, where this recipe came from, there were a lot of German settlers early on, and maybe in their home country, maybe almonds were used in recipes like this, but in the South, it was always pecans. And the Germans brought this way of making a meringue dessert, and it's often called Schaumtorte in some places in the Midwest, but in the South, we give it names like Nutty Delight, so who knows? And we're going to turn this mixture into a greased pie pan, and then this goes in a 350 oven. Couldn't be simpler.
I'm Demetria Kaladimos. It's Banner & Company. Thank you so much for doing this. I am a lover of cookbooks. In fact, one of my most treasured is the one my mother gave me as a wedding gift in 1984. And it's out of print now. And that's always a risk, isn't it? That a treasured cookbook is going to be unfindable later.
It might be, although I've found it's a pleasure to be here talking to you. But I've always found that you can find books. I mean, you can find old ones with this through estate sales, thriftbooks.com, abebooks.com. You can find them, but they're fun to hang on to.
So they tell me you were reading cookbooks when all the rest of us were reading 17 and L.
It's very true. It's very true. I started writing at the Nashville Banner when I was in high school. I was the editor of the high school newspaper at Harpethal Logos too. And I got an internship, I can't remember how, at the Banner, and would write during the summers and would write over Christmas. And Bernie Arnold, who was the food editor there, became a good friend of mine, a mentor. And I would go back, and I was on the news side. I had to write obituaries, believe it or not, take dictation from Capitol Hill reporters, which was just terribly stressful and awful. But then I would go back to Bernie's office and the food department, and she was getting in all those cookbooks. And she would just give me piles of cookbooks to take home and read. And I did. I read them as a teenager. I loved it. I just absolutely fell into other people's writing that way, and it reinforced my interest in cooking and baking.
And your approach, though, is really to write, at least in this volume, a history.
Very much so where I am in my career right now. You know, I've written the easy books, The Cake Mix Doctor, I wrote The Quick and Easy, I did all that. But I think where I am now, I'm fascinated by certain things. I certainly have loved writing this book about the South because it's my home region, but I write really honestly about the South. And I write about maybe what I approach a topic on Southern baking much differently than a lot of people would, because I feel like if you're going to really understand Southern baking, you have to understand the South, and you have to understand the region and the land and the people who settled here or who were forcibly brought here.
In a broadest sense, what makes Southern baking different than if someone's up in Massachusetts?
Well, the land and the people, because we have coastlines, we have farmland, we have bayous, we have mountains. And we have people from Western Europe. We have people from the Caribbean. We have, again, the enslaved from Africa. We have this incredible melting pot that contributed to the way we cook and the way we bake in all of these different regions. The South is the size of Western Europe. We are, I think, the most unique area of America, and I do believe that we have the first and the finest style of baking in the country.
You, of course, had servants in the South as well, people that were employed to make the food for others.
Absolutely.
And did that develop different palates?
Well, that's a really good question. I think it reinforced a style of baking and cooking that might have been classically Southern, perhaps rooted in English and French cooking that came from Virginia. And as the enslaved and servants moved throughout the South, depending on agriculture, the South was driven by agriculture. What was grown? What crops were grown? Was it cotton? Was it sugar cane? Those styles of cooking, the grand dinners, the fried chicken, the coconut cakes, those stayed on the menu because there were people in the kitchen making that food. It really wasn't until, I would say, the 1940s, 1950s, the Great Migration, when a lot of blacks left the South, that the South really had looked in the mirror and wondered what types of recipes would stay. You know, what types of recipes can you continue to make? And I think we were definitely influenced by factors that had to do with the post-war years. Oleo, like you mentioned. I look at my grandmother's recipe boxes from the 30s and the 40s, and there were a lot of dates. There were certain ingredients people used. There were a lot of graham crackers used in cakes because of the flour shortage during World War I. So it's so interesting how the culture, our country's history, all affected the South, and those are all of. I think those are the factors that make our region so unique and complicated at the same time.
I'm kind of hearkening back to my mother. Does baking always require precision? She said, don't even think you can't measure. Don't even try to not measure.
Right. Well, she's right. It needs a repetition and a pattern more than anything. Even if you can't read and you can't measure, you can remember that you filled the cup 3 times with flour, 2 times with sugar. You pulled 4 eggs out of the icebox. Those were things that people, even if they couldn't read or write, they knew instinctively how to make a cake. But it's doing it the same way over and over and over. And since we're trying to make grandmother's recipes today, we don't know how she measured flour. And I talk about that in the book. So I think it's only guessing. Did she scoop down into the sack? Did she spoon flour into the measuring cup and level it off? Because those are 2 different amounts of flour.
Did she sift?
Exactly. Did she sift? Did she need to sift? And actually, in early recipes, of course they needed to sift because there was no telling what was in the flour. You had to sift out the bad stuff. I sort of laugh at sifting flour today because we've come so full circle. I mean, the type of flour that you can buy is anywhere from finely white bleached cake flour like Swan's Down to something like a locally grown wheat that's been locally milled into flour that's very nubby and nutty tasting and completely different. But I think, so as a writer in recipes, that was tricky because I could only guess what grandmother used in a recipe and sort of advise you that this is the type of flour you ought to use. And if you have a lot of leavening in a cake recipe, like baking powder, baking soda, if you have a lot of spices in the cake, I do think it's a good idea to sift because I think it's a way to get everything all distributed in with the flour.
Did you do a Julia sort of thing where you tasted everything?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Come on, you look like a rail. There's no way you ate all this stuff.
Oh, I did. We tested every single recipe, and some recipes dozens of times. Like the cantaloupe cream pie recipe that's in the book, I call it a railroad recipe because it it came about from a cook on a railroad car somewhere between Texas and Oklahoma and Arkansas, that area. And there were ripe cantaloupes on the train car. And he needed to use up those in some way in the cooking because they had to get rid of that freight and bring on more at the next stop. And so he could only cut up so much melon for breakfast in the dining cars, and came up with a recipe to use the juice of the cantaloupe, the really ripe cantaloupe, in making a meringue pie. And it went into the custard, and it's a fabulous recipe. And it's quirky, but it talks about migration and railroads. And we had to test that because sometimes, you buy a cantaloupe and it's ripe, and the next time it's not. So how do we make that recipe work for someone, no matter the ripeness of your cantaloupe? And we used the microwave. So it was like if it's not super ripe, you can microwave the chunks of cantaloupe for X amount of time, but you puree it in a food processor, strain out the juice, and that's what you use to cook on top of the stove with sugar and eggs, and it's really, really good.
That sounds marvelous. It's Banner & Company. I'm Demetria Kaladimos. We'll be right back.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
I'm going to go backwards a little bit here and ask you a little bit about the cake mix doctor. Is there shame in opening a boxed cake mix?
No. I think it's just kudos to you if you figured out a way to put a cake on the table. And that was what I said when I wrote that book 20 years ago, 25. I said, do what you do and do it well. And if you want to use a cake mix, that's fine. Make a homemade frosting. Do not buy canned, nasty frosting from the grocery shelf. Make homemade frosting, and here's how, and it's super easy. And that was my mantra, because at the time, my 3 children were all very young. My mom was not well, and I had a lot going on in my life. I completely understood why somebody needed a box of cake mix. But I got taken apart by national press for writing that book. It was a New York Times bestseller,
there you
I
go.
will have to say. And even to this day, people make fine strawberry cakes, caramel cakes, coconut cakes in the South that start with a cake mix, and I say that's okay.
How do you feel about cupcakes?
I think they've been overdone. Yeah, do you think so too?
I do.
Yeah, I think they're overdone, but I like the history behind them because they really were like a World War II recipe that kind of came out of women wanting to bake something at home and take into not the office, the factory. So it came out of women working out of the home for the first time, and they would bring in these cakes to share with their coworkers. So I love that story. I think they have too much frosting and too much icing. I always want to just get rid of that and eat the cake underneath it. But I share a couple of cupcake recipes in the book. One of them's a coconut snowball. One is just a yellow cupcake with a buttermilk, kind of a homemade fudge buttermilk pan frosting. Really good.
I'm getting hungry. What is the most interesting cake find in the book, and why? There are probably more than one, but I love the cantaloupe pie.
The cantaloupe pie. I think one cake comes to mind. It's called sticky lemon cake, and it is from an area of southwestern Georgia and southeastern Alabama. If you looked at those 2 states and you drew a little circle down there, like a Venn diagram, that would be the area of the South where Lane cake, which is that bourbony, boozy pecan and maraschino cherry confection Christmas cake, that comes from that area, as does sticky lemon. But sticky lemon is just layers of like a 1, 2, 3, 4. It's just a yellow vanilla cake. But in between is lemon curd, homemade lemon curd. And then you save the whites of the eggs that you don't use in the curd to make like a boiled white icing that you whip up. And it is so unique to that area. And there was a woman in Georgia. She grew up in Dalton, and she got in touch with me and told me about this grandmother's cake. And her grandmother had passed, and she always brought this lemon cake with her to Christmas. It was her Christmas cake. She had a carrier for it, and the family was really sad that she never wrote down the recipe. They couldn't carry that on, and so I remember from being a food editor in Atlanta at the Journal-Constitution. I knew that cake because my coworker was from Quitman, Georgia. She was from South Georgia, and that was her favorite cake. And I said, if you just give me a little bit of time, let me research it. I think we can come up with that cake. And we did. And it is a very common cake in Georgia. It is a fabulous cake. It's a 1, 2, 3, 4 cake with lemon curd frosting. I sent it to the family. They made it. Thumbs up, and I tell that story in the book. To me, that's full circle, yeah.
Where did the other tips come from? And were there any that you had to call time and say, I can't fit this in the book?
Oh, gosh, yes. We had to get rid of about 25 or 30 recipes just for space. It was getting fatter and fatter and fatter because I felt like it wasn't this, a lot of cookbooks are just recipes, but I wanted this one to have some meat on the bone, and I wanted each recipe to tell a story, either about that family in Georgia searching for grandmother's cake, or the quirkiness of these lemon and lane cakes coming from only this little small region of the South. Why is that? To the crisscrossing of railroads. Every recipe to me told a story, a time and a place in the South, and it made the South really come to life, and it made the South much more diverse than I ever knew it was before. Yeah.
I opened right up to Flatten Scruggs and Martha White, and I always wanted to know what the heck is hot rise.
Yeah, well, that was how they marketed the flour, the self-rising flour and self-rising cornmeal, to a working class of people who listened to the Opry. I mean, they were genius. They combined good old country music with country cooking and reached those people first thing in the morning. And they had to, and that was what was genius too, was that they knew that people were going to get out of the house and get in the field. They had to get to work. But they would listen to music early in the morning, and that's when they advertised about that self-rising flour, those hot rise biscuits.
What's the best Nashville recipe in this book?
I'm glad you asked that question because it has definitely been on my mind. I believe that in the past, going back, Nashville probably had through Satsuma Tea Room and some other old places. There was also a restaurant called Kleeman's in the 1940s. So I'd say my favorite Nashville recipe is the cream chicken on egg bread because it is uniquely Nashville. I have not seen that anywhere else. The idea that you could cook this whole chicken, take it off the bone, and use the stock to make this really yummy sauce with cream in it, and then you put the chicken back in, and then you serve this cream chicken over a very eggy cornbread, a square of real eggy cornbread. And it is the most delicious thing. I have made it for friends that come in for dinner. It's the most delicious thing because it's cornbread, but it's kind of like a souffle. It's almost like spoon bread as well. It's very wet and eggy and delicious, and then you've got this cream chicken. And that was one of my mother's favorite recipes, and she had it written on a card. And I also have found it in the Nashville cookbook, which was written by the Home Economics Association here many years ago. So I love that. I do think that variations of chess pie are very Nashville, especially if they have vinegar and cornmeal in them, because that is uniquely to this area. You see chess pie in other parts of the South, but often there will be flour in a recipe and not cornmeal. But the use of cornmeal in a pie recipe tells you that that's what they had access to. And although that's kind of a hard scrabble kind of recipe too, it really kind of is more like the mountains, where you see vinegar used in baking recipes instead of lemon juice because the people of the mountains have had no access to fresh fruit or lemons.
Wow. I confess, I looked at chess pie the first time it was served to me. I had no idea what the heck it was. It was cloyingly sweet. It was just too sweet for me.
I agree.
Is that an acquired taste, or are there variations on the sweetness of chess?
I think that it's typical of everybody now. We taste a lot of old Southern recipes, and they are too sweet. And I do say that in the book, and I take that in consideration. I reduced the sugar in the Nashville chess pie. I also added both cornmeal and flour, because I think the consistency you get, the filling is less likely to separate. Cornmeal does not thicken. It does not hold a custard mixture together. It doesn't have the gluten in it that wheat flour does. So knowing what I know about baking now, I was able to take a grandmother's recipe and half cornmeal, half flour, but still use the apple cider vinegar and get that tang that I like from a chess pie, and reduce the sugar. And also it may have a smidge of salt. Believe that our ancestors would have been baking. If they baked with butter, they would have used salted butter. And I think that kind of gets lost in modern day recipes, because we try to make them and we're using unsalted butter, and something's kind of flat and missing, or it tastes too sweet. Use the salt, use about a half a teaspoon of salt per stick of butter to really bring up the flavor. It's fascinating. And then I think our palates today are less sweet. We don't want things as sweet. And I removed sugar in a chocolate meringue pie recipe from the Delta in Mississippi because I felt like the filling was sweet, the meringue was sweet. They didn't need to both be sweet. So I took 6 tablespoons of sugar out of the filling, kept it in the meringue, which needs to be sweet, and it was the perfect balance of flavors.
What was your special dinner or dish growing up as a family? Were you from a great cook?
I was. I grew up here in Nashville. My mother was a great cook. She was the 5th of 5 daughters, but because of that, and she was born in 25, her mother didn't spend a lot of time in the kitchen with her. Her mother had to go back to work. And so my mother learned everything by herself. But she had really close friendships with her sisters, and they kept that throughout all their lives. But my mom was very creative. She made beautiful food. Again, nobody taught her to cook. She just loved color. She just would decorate food. She would carve watermelon baskets. I mean, I grew up with that, homemade cinnamon rolls. So I had a lot of really rich food memories growing up that I know fueled my career.
And what were great Nashville specialties of your childhood?
Oh, wow. Back then it was fried chicken, and she served it with rice, which was very now and so low country or so New Orleans. Where did that come from? But it was great. Fried chicken and rice and some sort of green vegetable, green beans, peas, white gravy over the rice, chicken gravy, homemade biscuits or homemade yeast rolls, and always a pie. I mean, I grew up here in Nashville. We had probably had homemade pies 3 or 4 times a week. Chocolate meringue pie, lemon meringue pie, banana cream pie, coconut cream pie, all of the cream pies. We had them all. And it was just, my mother loved pie. She loved to make meringue. She thought it was beautiful. So she was a really talented cook who nobody had ever taught, but she could tell. Actually, she told me something once. She said, I can tell what a recipe tastes like just by looking at it.
Looking at the finished product?
By reading the recipe. Just
by reading the words.
She goes, I can taste that recipe just by looking at it. And I think it's really true. I think when you love to cook and you like food and you like to read cookbooks, you hit on a recipe that it just sounds good and you can taste it.
And great cooks also improvise and add their own thing.
Definitely.
Did your mother share those secrets?
She did. She would shortcut sometime for that chocolate meringue pie. She might start with a box of Jell-O instant pudding mix, but then she'd say you always add 1 bar of unsweetened chocolate, a couple tablespoons of butter, a little vanilla to kind of jazz it up a little bit. Yeah, she would share. She was a generous person. She was not one of those Southern women who were real competitive about their recipes, and didn't share. She shared, usually around the bridge table, swap recipes on napkins, yeah.
Did she do the state fair route and blue ribbons and all that?
No. I don't know why she didn't do that. She probably didn't have the courage to do that. And she would have hit upon those competitive women who I think she was just sort of naturally turned off by. So she just wasn't into that. So she didn't go that route. She also didn't cook with cast iron, which I think is so interesting now. Everything is cast iron skillets and all. But she considered that mountain cooking. And she was from Nashville. She was a city girl. She wanted to be a city girl. She married a city guy and raised a city family, although he was a farm boy whose parents were from West Tennessee.
True confession, I knew nothing of cast iron until I moved down here, and I did not know how you prepared or seasoned the pan. I mean, for those of other ignorant people out there who may not know, what do you do to a cast iron?
Oh, boy. 2 factors, high heat and fat. So if you want to quickly season a cast iron skillet, take it out to the barbecue grill, heat up the grill to, 500 or 600 degrees. Get some ground chuck and press it into hamburgers. And take those out there and cook hamburgers in that skillet at about 500 degrees, and you will start the seasoning process. Because that's why it's heat and oil that make that sort of polymer black shiny coating. And that's why the prettiest skillets are the ones that we're used to fry chicken.
And then you don't soap them up and wash them, do you?
Exactly. You don't put them in the dishwasher, of course. And, you rarely use soap. Although the lodge people will say it's okay to use a little bit of soap. If you've cooked fish or maybe you've got kind of sticky cobbler or something in them, use a little soap. But if you put a little water in a sticky skillet and put it back on top of the stove, heat it up, use like a wooden spoon or some of those real little metal sort of scrapers now they make for cleaning cast iron. They're called the ring. One of them's called the ringer. They're great. And you just sort of rub the little particles away. They'll go right down the drain. And then a little hot water, wipe it out nicely and heat it. I heat it back up on the stove to dry it out.
Oh, nice.
And then, I store them on top of an old chest in my kitchen, a cherry cabinet. And then that way they don't, get rusty, and they're my friends.
There you go. A little secret on Banner & Company.
There you go.
Thank us later. It's Banner & Company. My guest is best-selling cookbook author and former Banner intern, Anne Byrn. We'll be right back. Let's go through some of these tips that are so great. Some biscuit myths and rules and preferences.
Right. The myth might be that I just can't make good biscuits, Well, that's a myth. Everybody can make great biscuits. You just have to practice, because the more you make biscuits, the better you get at it. You need a wet dough, not dry. You need a hot oven, 450 to 500. And even better, put them in that cast iron skillet. They're going to get crispy on the bottom. Don't be afraid to leave them a little thick. Pat out the dough. Don't roll it too thinly, and cut straight down. And if you like soft biscuits, squish them together. Put them in the pan next to each other. But if you like crispy biscuits, spread them apart.
You like butter instead of lard?
I do like butter instead of lard, but I can see the benefit of baking with lard in biscuits and also in pie crust, because it adds a savory quality. It just plays nicely with peach preserves or sorghum or honey. And especially so many pies, as we mentioned, are sweet in the South. If you've got a lard-based pie crust, it gives it a salty, kind of savory note, which is a nice complement to the sweetness, yeah.
Cold dough?
Cold dough, definitely. And some of the folks and these recipes that are in the book, we should say, come from cooks across the South, of only a handful of my family recipes. And that's where I was able to glean a lot of information. But yes, some of the cooks actually cut their biscuits and froze the dough. And then pulled them out of the freezer hard and put them in that 450 to 500 degree oven where they're going to shoot straight up, because it's the steam that's created in the dough.
Do you ever crack a can?
No, I don't like the flavor of canned biscuits. I understand the flakiness, and I can understand how everybody is obsessed with pulling all those little layers apart. And believe me, I've done it too. I think spending the night at other people's houses growing up was an eye-opener for me, coming from a house where my mother made biscuits from scratch, fried her own chicken, that kind of thing. So going to other people's houses, we had these pop and bake biscuits and other things.
Let's talk banana pudding.
Yeah.
Why is that? I mean, if they didn't have lemons, how the heck did they get bananas?
Through the railroad cars. And that's really how bananas came from the coast of Central and South American bananas, landed in Mobile, Gulfport, New Orleans, and were loaded onto railroad cars. Before there were refrigerated railroad cars, they actually would put blocks of ice in these cars and lay the big bunches of bananas on top so that they would go north. And there was a railroad switch point distribution center that came about in Fulton, Kentucky, which is right on the Tennessee line. And it became the banana capital of the South. I mean, who knew? And to this day, it still has a banana festival there with the world's largest banana pudding.
Really?
I had no idea about Fulton, Kentucky, so it was finding an old recipe for banana pudding in an old Kentucky cookbook, sort of opened my eyes to how bananas became a really integral part of Southern baking. And I believe it's because they always seemed otherworldly, right?
Exotic.
I mean, you couldn't grow them in your garden. You couldn't grow them in your backyard. And so the South became obsessed with bananas, and banana pudding became the dessert of the South. And I think it is the dessert of the South because it breaks barriers, right? I mean, you can be rich or poor and love banana pudding, black or white. You can live on the coast, you can live on the farmlands of Kentucky and love banana pudding.
Jewish culture in Southern baking. That surprised me a little bit.
Yeah, very interesting because they brought a culture of baking with them. You think about it. The recipes from Germany and Eastern Europe, parts of Spain, they involved baking. Those were challah and babka and marbled cakes and the use of chocolate and spices. Think about cinnamon. How much cinnamon is used in coffee cakes? The coffee cakes of the South are originally Jewish cakes, which I love. And so I have a church lady's cinnamon coffee cake recipe in the book, which I know its roots are Jewish. It's great. The jam cake, that's another cake. The blackberry jam cake, I would say, is very Middle Tennessee and Kentucky. It's a spice cake with blackberry jam in the batter, and then you pour a caramel icing over the top of it. It can be a layer cake, it could be a bundt, but that was originally a Jewish cake, and it was a German cake, and it was baked for Rosh Hashanah. And then some of the Passover recipes from Savannah, the chocolate chewies that are flourless, baked for Passover. That's a recipe that's over 100 years old, 1885. Yeah.
Are there macaroons in here?
There are not, but they are a chocolate macaroon, essentially, because it's egg whites, sugar, and cocoa. It's really fascinating. And to learn more, I learned, to research the Southern Jewish culture and to realize how many towns had Jewish populations, but maybe or maybe not, they had a synagogue or had a community of cooks. There were places in South Georgia and parts of South Carolina where challah was put on Greyhound buses and shipped to other towns where there were Jewish families throughout the South. They would place their order through Gottlieb's Bakery in Savannah, and the bread was shipped out.
Wow.
It's fascinating, really is.
And of course, the civil rights movement and baking.
Definitely, absolutely. I mean, and that was an integral part of this book. When I say that Southern baking is complicated, I really mean that. It's based on sugar and slavery, and those topics right there are very complicated. The enslaved cooks brought with them a knowledge of rice-based cuisine, which is what became low-country cuisine, essentially. The use of rice in waffles and in breads, croquettes. That was a way of cooking, but they also understood rice cultivation, and they were brought to South Carolina in the 1700s to establish the rice fields and to cultivate and grow the rice. So we are just incredibly incredibly thankful to their contribution. And I had to talk about that. And of course, I had to talk about the civil rights movement and how race and race relations have even affected Southern baking, and how during the late 1950s in Montgomery with the bus boycotts, there were black cooks who baked pound cakes and sold them to fund alternative transportation in the Deep South. And the bus boycott went on over a year, but these women who were a part of a club, they called the Club from Nowhere. And they called it that because no one would believe what they were doing. But black women have always baked, and they have often sold what they baked at churches or to fund these efforts. And they were this invisible club of baking to fund a civil rights movement right there in Montgomery, Alabama. And to me, that is an incredible part of our story in the South.
Yeah, I mean, because who doesn't want to? I mean, bake sales. It's the greatest way to make money.
Exactly. And what your mother said about baking and knowing how to bake, there is an art to baking, and women in particular have been able to monetize that, right? And the old first cookbooks that didn't give you any instructions, that's because they were written by bakers for bakers. People knew. But if you didn't know, you wanted to learn because you could earn more money. You might be able to cook in the house and not work in the fields. You might ultimately be working in a kitchen where there was air conditioning. You would hope someday that you might have a better shift. You could work in the morning so that you could take care of your children at night. And I think that has always been the upside to baking, is that it has been a skill that people have paid for.
Banner & Company is a production of the New Nashville Banner. Our producers are Steve Harouche and Andrea Tudhope. Original music by Verlin Thompson. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or go to NashvilleBanner.com. You're in good company. We have a little tradition here on Banner & Company. The final question in the podcast comes from a previous guest, and it's in that pink fishbowl. Oh, wow. So pick one out and read it aloud.
Okay. From Amanda Little. I love it. If you could travel
into space and cost was no object, would you or would you not, and why?
Amanda, you're going to be very disappointed with me because I'm going to say I wouldn't. I think because I'm 68, I'm perfectly happy. I've got one grandchild who's 5. My kids are in a happy place right now, and I've just been able to write the book of my dreams. Like, why would I want to go? Why do I want to leave this place? Why would I want to go someplace? I don't even like to go across a bridge and look down at the water. So that's my final answer.